let's start, if you don't mind, by telling our audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, thanks, Doug, and thanks for having me on. I am new to the Valley. I think I'm on day 15 as president of University of the Pacific. Before coming out, Gene and I, for the last 15 years, were in Arizona, where I worked at Arizona State University as Dean of the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Also ran our PBS station, Arizona PBS, there. Before that, 15 years at University of Maryland at their fine journalism school. And before that, like you, I was a working journalist.
Oh, and by working, you worked at the AP in New England and Washington, D.C. Any
That's
particular assignments that stand out in your mind?
Mostly, I would say mostly politics. I covered 4 different state houses in New England, and then of course in Washington, D.C. And a lot of, as like you, Doug, a lot of wonderful stories I got to cover, a lot of sad stories. The Washington stories are much less memorable, I will say, than the stories that actually involve real people. And one of the stories I got to cover was when the Titanic was rediscovered, and they were doing expeditions, and Dr. Ballard was there, and we would go out to Woods Hole and take their calls from there and file reports from the Cape. And then also when I was in Rhode Island, and Rhode Island's a fascinating place for news, I was the lead reporter for the retrial of Klaus von Bülow, which was one of the most, as you remember, one of the most prominent trials at that time. So a lot of really interesting experiences.
Well, now you're sitting on one of the prettiest campuses on the West Coast, most people would say, and I don't think there'd be much argument against that. But what is your vision for the University of the Pacific?
Well, thanks for asking, Doug, and I couldn't agree more. Isn't it just an absolutely spectacular campus? And I've been to probably 100 different American universities over the course of the last few decades. I've never been to a prettier campus, and it really conjures up to me images of New England in many ways, in style and architecture and the like. Pacific has a fantastic history. And I think what we're going to try to do over the next few years is to continue to move Pacific forward, but really focusing on what makes this university so special. And to me, that's a couple of things. It's first of all, we have 3 different, very distinctive campuses, as you know. The main campus here in Stockton, also in Sacramento, where we have the McGeorge School of Law and our new School of Health Sciences, and then in San Francisco with the world-class Dugoni School of Dentistry. So that makes it very distinctive. But I think the thing that got me most excited about coming to Pacific was it's almost like 2 different institutions in one. So when you come to, particularly when you come to the Stockton campus, it almost feels like a small liberal arts campus, where you have very small classes, you have these wonderful relationships between the students and faculty, really personalized learning that you would much more typically see at a small college environment. And yet you have that learning in a comprehensive university with 10 different schools and 100 different majors and Division I sports, 150 extracurricular activities, and that's unusual. So you have, I came from a comprehensive university, and you have a lot of choice there. And of course, we know about the small liberal arts college. Very rarely do you see and find both of those elements in the same institution. And I think that's really what gets me the most excited about Pacific.
Your predecessor made a large effort to essentially, not physically, obviously, but tear down the walls, if you will, and have the university more involved with the community. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I thought Pam did a fantastic job, and she really did have that wonderful connectivity, not just to the city of Stockton, but the whole region, and to some degree, the whole state. And we want to continue on that outstanding work. It's been, I will tell you, Doug, it's been a little hard to make those connections in our COVID world, but we are trying through these sorts of Zoom conversations. But I think it's essential that any great university needs to be part of its community in a positive way. In how can we help and how can we be part of that community? How can we be adding to the richness of that community? And the community has so much to offer the university and our students. And there's certainly job opportunities and internship opportunities and research opportunities for our faculty and students. So I think higher education works best when you have that very, very close relationship between the communities that we're in and the university. And I think you're absolutely right. I thought Pam Ibeck did just a fantastic job of setting the stage for that.
Now, we're recording this just a few hours after the Trump administration rescinded its announced plan to boot out students from other countries who had to go to strictly online classes. So that's no longer going to be a factor this fall. But what will classes look like at Pacific this fall with the pandemic still running rampant?
Yeah, and that is the $64,000 question, Doug. And I know this sounds crazy, but we still don't exactly know because COVID is changing so much. So I can tell you that for the last 2 or 3 months, we've been designing a plan where we can bring back our students and our faculty and our staff in safe and smart environments, which would mean a whole bunch of new different protocols and procedures where our students and faculty would be wearing masks. We would be in larger classes that are more spread out. We would have some students remoting in, others being in physically there. And that was, quite frankly, a Herculean effort by our faculty and staff. And it's a terrific plan, most of which has been executed on right now. The big question is, will we be able to do it a month from now? And I honestly can't answer that because over the last month, as you know, particularly in our communities, COVID-19 has gone from being fairly steady and relatively low, still serious, but still relatively few cases, to just a dramatic spike in trajectory. So we're still monitoring the situation carefully. The governor's office, still has not put out rules and regulations for higher education. So we're monitoring that. But I can tell you, no matter what happens, our students will get a Pacific quality education. I hope that's on our campuses. Temporarily, it might not be. It might be in remote environments, but it will be with our same great faculty members, taking the same courses, with the same learning objectives and outcomes. And worst case scenario is for some limited period of time without being physically here. But we have to do what is best and what is safest for our students, faculty, and staff. So.
Well, now that your crystal ball is kind of cranked up and humming right along, from your catbird seat at the Cronkite School and University of Maryland and now Pacific, what do you see for the future of news? Now, there's a softball question, but you can hit this one out of the park if you'd like to take a swing at it.
I thank you, Doug. And I suspect, like you, I worry a lot about the news industry. And I draw a big distinction between the news industry and journalism. Journalism, I would argue, has never been more important and more essential to our lives, especially community journalism, to inform readers and viewers about what's going on in our communities in an objective, fact-based way. As the world gets more complicated, I think that function becomes more and more important in order to have an informed citizenry and to make informed decisions. The problem, so that is stronger than ever. The problem is on the business side, the news as an industry, and it is an industry, as you know, and it's been an industry that I would argue did not have a lot of forward thinking 20 years ago. And the result of that was, and it's not surprising on some level, because especially newspapers, but television, radio also, they had these fantastically large profit margins. by doing exactly what they've been doing for decades. So the result was they didn't do a lot in research and development. They didn't do a lot of forward looking. And then this thing called the internet apparently started catching on. And smart entrepreneurs that were not in the news industry started taking advantage of that. And of course, the first was Craigslist with our classified ads in newspapers, which was such a big source of revenue for newspapers. And then now more recently with Google and Facebook on advertising. And that base has just been absolutely gutted. So right now, that business model, that traditional business model, particularly for newspapers, is absolutely broken, and it's just not working. And what we need to do, we need to have smart people who are reconceptualizing what the future of the business side of news is going to look like. Because people want to be informed. People want that information. And my concern is, as these news organizations start to wane, the citizenry will be less informed and less able to make smart decisions about their own futures.
Well, that is the billion-dollar question, and that is, what is the business model of the future? With Google and Facebook having invented a business model that I would argue borders on thievery. How many journalists does Twitter employ? I would suspect you could put them in a phone booth if you could find a phone booth. So what is the business model if they are taking the product of journalists and paying a pittance if they pay anything for it, and then reconfiguring it so they have a dynamic advertising force, and they haven't had to pay for the stuff. So where does it end up?
And I think it's not singular, it's plural. So in other words, there's not a single economic model for the news industry in the future. It's a confederation, I think, of economic models. Some of which could still be from that traditional advertising base. Some of which I think is going to have to come from philanthropy, and you're seeing cases of this in positive ways around the country. Some of it is going to have to be a resetting, where people who have been very used to getting their information for free, because as you know, the traditional news, once we went online, we gave it away. Once you're giving something away, it's very hard to start charging for it again. So I think we need to continue down that road and make that value proposition to our readers and viewers that this is important, and it does have a value. It does have an economic value to you personally. And then I think public media, and you're starting to see this actually growing in many places, particularly on the radio side. Some fantastic work being done in public radio. And then there's even, and this is going to sound like sacrilege, but there may even be need for some government intervention in terms of, if the question is fact-based news so important to a democracy and so endangered in our democracy that we need to protect it in some way, shape, or form? And I hesitate to even suggest that because that is sort of antithetical to how I usually approach marketplace decisions. But I think we're at the point now where I think we need to give that serious consideration, to have some sort of protections for fact-based news to survive and thrive.
Now, just a couple of final questions, if you don't mind. If you were able to look behind you virtually, you would see the photo of the iconic University of the Pacific water tower, which was at one point the studios and transmitter site of a very fine FM public radio station, sold off 10 years or so ago for whatever reasons, who knows. But is there a role for Pacific in public broadcasting? And if so, what do you think that will be?
Yeah, and that's a great question. As you know, Doug, we don't have a journalism school per se, although we have some fine communications programs, including something called Media X, which is really exciting, forward-looking, sort of multidisciplinary degree program, which can be very exciting. So I think, I'm biased. I love communications. I always will. So what role will Pacific play within that, and specifically in public media? I don't know. I haven't really, I've thought about it, although I must be honest, in the last few months, pretty much the only thing I've been thinking about is all things related to COVID-19. So, but I think that's certainly something worth exploring. And to your point, we have this fantastic tradition of that public service news and information to our community. So,
In other words, time will tell,
I will tell.
as they say, as they used to say.
And certainly opportunities for partnerships, I think are always there.
You've been very gracious with your time and your observations, but what would you like to add that I just haven't been bright enough to ask you?
Well, no, I've enjoyed the conversation, Doug. I would add something about today's students. And I will tell you, I hear often people being critical of today's college age student. Oh, they're this, they're that, they're entitled, they're what have you. And I couldn't disagree with that more. I've had the pleasure of working with young people now for most of my professional career. And I can tell you, as time has gone on, what I have found is generationally increases in maturity, in empathy, in focus, in seriousness of what they're trying to achieve, a deep understanding of their own personal goals and aspirations. I'm so inspired by our young people today. And I will tell you, when I got to Pacific, and one of the reasons why I'm here is that is amplified in our communities. When I get to meet with our students, I am just so excited and so inspired by them. As you know, our students were a much more diverse campus than many universities. And I mean that on all dimensions, ethnicity, economic, and that, I think, adds to the richness of our university. And I'm just so excited to have all of our students back so we can start engaging with them in person.